On behalf of Citigroup, I really would like to thank AGI and Jeff for being here today, and all esteemed guests and speakers. I think I have been associated as a board of trustee member with AGI for many, many years, and I still do remember Trump 1.0, so we're 2.0 now. And I think also as we advised our clients throughout the last year, going to the capital markets, there was one thing we said, I mean, the world is getting ever more unpredictable. You need to prepare for much more uncertainty. And I think it's so crucial to have people like you helping us understanding this world. Also, if you don't have answers to everything, but adding perspectives and helping us navigating something which is ever more dynamic and requiring us to adjust for that. Very pleased to have you here in our new office. I think, Jeff, I said to you, you're a guinea pig here. We just moved the last people about 4 weeks ago, and we're really still testing the facility in a way. But glad to be here. We were exceeding the space we had in Welle. And again, 3 years ago, took the decision to move 500 people over here, and quite modern setup, and also great that we can host events like this here, and very pleased with that. Thanks for being here, and Jeff, over to you.
Well, thank you, Stefan. I know so many of you, so I feel almost like I don't have to introduce myself, but just for sake of completeness, I'm Jeff Rathke, the president of the American-German Institute at Johns Hopkins University. And I want to thank you, first of all, Stefan, for your leadership, for your support as a member of our board of trustees, and also for Citi's gracious hosting of this event today in your new spaces. We're happy to be that guinea pig that you talked about. We are in uncharted territory in the United States. Maybe you've noticed. There are fundamental constitutional, legal, and administrative issues that have been brought to the fore at the very start of the second Trump administration. And these are really about the nature of how our government works and how it will work in the future. These are primarily a matter of domestic politics, and we already see these things being tenaciously fought over through the American political system. And this, I think, is going to shape American politics, certainly for the coming months, as these initial challenges get hashed out. But then, of course, looking ahead to the normal course of a 4-year term, which is a midterm election in 2026, and the next presidential election in 2028. So aside from the domestic impact of the second Trump administration, this, of course, has a major effect on America's foreign relations. We've seen this already in the first few weeks. There have been dramatic departures from traditional lines, a confrontational approach to America's neighbors, confrontational tactics in other regards, as well as efforts to change fundamentally the nature of the administrative infrastructure of the American international engagement. For example, the efforts to halt the activity of the U.S. Agency for International Development. So if anyone wondered how ambitiously and disruptively Donald Trump was going to approach his second term, I think any of those questions should be answered. And now the question is, what does this mean for the United States relations with Europe, or U.S. relations with Germany and the EU? And that is going to be our focus today. What will this impact have? What impact will this have on the U.S. Relationship? This is, of course, important also because in Germany, you are 11 days away from a federal election, which is going to lead to a new coalition of some sort that will be different from the previous coalition. I think it's fair to say. And this new government will take office at a time when the Trump administration will probably have reached its highway cruising speed. So the question of how the German government will engage with its American counterpart is going to be another particularly important question for the largest economy and the largest population in Europe. So what economic and trade challenges must we master? How are these going to affect economic security? We will hear about this in our first panel, which is going to be led by my colleague, Peter Rashish, who is the Vice President of AGI and Director of our geoeconomics program. And then in the latter part of the afternoon, we are going to discuss the foreign and security policy agenda that is going to mark the next 4 years. We will be led in that session by Dr. Andreas Nick, who is someone the Institute has worked with in many capacities over the years, and who is now, after his career in the Bundestag, now a partner at Brunswick. So allow me now just to take a moment to thank the people who are making it possible for us to hold this symposium today. I've already thanked Stefan and Citi, but I'll do it again. Let me thank as well Skadden and Cerberus and Brunswick and 360T for making all of this possible. And with that, I want to hand things over to Peter Rashish, who will introduce the first panel and get us started. So Peter, over to you.
So as Jeff mentioned, we are already seeing some major changes in U.S. policy. I think it's true that under the Biden administration, we began to see some questioning of the value of what could be called a somewhat aging international economic order. But if you look at the early Trump measures on tariffs, I think it's clear that we're seeing it's really another level of challenge to that order compared to what we've seen before. And so today in the first session, we'll look at what's at stake for U.S., German, and EU economic security. We'll take that as a lens, and also what works best to promote it, because I think you've seen that despite that questioning that I hinted at, you've seen different ways to go about it. You've seen under the previous administration in the U.S., we saw emphasis on industrial policy. Both in the U.S. and the EU, we see an emphasis on de-risking, but in the EU also continued interest in free trade agreements. And then in the Trump administration seems to be putting a serious emphasis on tariffs. But I think it's also worth looking at what the economic and political trade-offs of these various instruments are, because there almost always are some trade-offs. Just in terms of housekeeping, after some brief opening remarks from each panelist, I will then engage them in a first round of conversation, and then we look forward to hearing your questions and also the questions from those of you who are online. So I will now sit down and get things going. And to do that, I will briefly introduce our panelists. Coming from Washington, Brooks Allen, who is the lead coordinator of the international trade practice at the Washington law firm Skadden. He focuses his practice on reviews of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. and other international trade and investment issues. Laura von Daniels is head of the research division of the Americas at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, known to those of you in Germany as the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. Her areas of expertise include international finance, debt, foreign trade, and U.S. economic policy. Arne Holzhausen is head of insurance, wealth, and ESG in the economic research arm of Allianz in Munich, where he analyzes and forecasts global insurance and pension markets. And Penny Nass is the lead for Allied Strategic Competitiveness at the German Marshall Fund in Washington and an advisor for Trade Experts, which is a global organization of women trade experts, and she has also previously worked at UPS and Citigroup and the U.S. Department of Commerce. So I will ask as I mentioned, I'll ask each of the panelists to get us started with about 5 minutes of opening remarks. Brooks, let me turn to you first and ask, you've worked in the U.S. Trade Representative's office, and I think it was during the first Trump administration, if I'm right. What do you see the experience of that first administration and also the president's actions so far in the second one, telling us about the likely contours of trade and economic security policies over the next few years?
Sure. So, thank you. I think he has been much more aggressive right out of the gate. No question about that. We've seen just really an explosion of activity and use of tariffs, obviously, just in the few short weeks that we've had under the second Trump administration. And I think in part it really reflects an evolution in his thinking about tariffs since the first Trump administration. Tariffs were certainly a tool that he used in the first Trump administration. We saw them, the Section 232 national security tariffs that he used for steel and aluminum. We saw that with the Section 301 tariffs used on Chinese imports, and some safeguard measures used for things like washing machines and other products. But he also had free trade agreements that he negotiated. There were a number of other trade initiatives. So it was more of a kind of balanced approach. And I think he was also sort of getting his footing and thinking was sort of growing and nascent about trade generally at that point. He's had a lot more time to think about these things. He's had more experience under his belt. And I think now, he really sort of views tariffs as kind of, really sort of the Swiss Army knife of kind of economic and foreign policy in many ways. So, he sees tariffs, for example, as, a source of revenue to, for instance, replace foregone revenue for the tax cuts that he'd like to extend. And there are many, for example, in the U.S. Congress who sort of agree with him and now see that as an important source of potential revenue, as a means of promoting decoupling with China, of getting sort of leverage over trading partners. In the case of the Canada-Mexico tariffs, addressing immigration concerns or drug trafficking, fentanyl issues, or look at the dust up with Colombia over accepting deportees, right? Threatening tariffs, or even territorial expansion. Think about threatening tariffs with Denmark to hand over Greenland. Didn't see that coming, I can tell you that. So again, multi-purpose tool, and we've seen him deploy that pretty aggressively here right out of the gate. And so again, a lot of reasons why, or a lot of justifications or motives underlie these different policy tools. And so it's difficult, in many cases to sort of parse out, why is he doing this, right? And I think, some clues to what he's thinking and why he's doing some of this can be gleaned from his America First trade policy memo that he issued on his inauguration day. And it sets out kind of a work plan for trade in his second term. And it basically tasks various agencies with preparing various reports on various topics. But it really also sets out, I think, implicitly a lot of his trade objectives. But it also sets the tone, and it really kind of, it sets out some of the ideologies, some of the thinking, some of the general orientation. And it really is kind of a philosophy of grievance, right? An ideology of grievance, that the US has been wrong, right? It says we need to address the unfair and unbalanced trade. It focuses heavily on the trade deficit. And we talked about the deficit, of course, in goods trade, right? Never focusing on trade and services, where, of course, the US very frequently, as it has with Europe, has a very large surplus. And the need for reciprocity, right? And the feeling that the US has been taken advantage of. And so the need to redress that, right? So that's another key sort of kind of philosophical orientation and objective, or at least something that's important for messaging, right? And in some ways, it echoes some of his domestic policy objectives, similar kind of grievance approaches and arguments, right? So in terms of like where we're kind of, how do we translate that into what we've been seeing? So we see a number of measures now, and obviously we've all been following these, right? So, we see the Canada, Mexico, China tariffs, 25%. And, obviously those didn't go into effect for Canada and Mexico. We have this pause. Will it be extended? I think very reasonably good odds it will be extended, and hopefully for longer than 30 days, because no one can plan for for commercial purposes kind of on a month at a time. China, of course, we have this now retaliatory cycle here, and those appear to be there to stay for some period of time. We have the steel and aluminum tariffs that were announced, 25% for each, which really blew up this sort of fragile piece that we had from the sort of Trump administration, Biden administration, where the U.S. had imposed these tariffs, other countries had retaliated, and then various quotas or tariff rate quotas were entered into as a condition of these other countries saying that they would forego retaliation. So all those agreements, all those deals have now been blown up. And then as of mid-March, those tariffs will go into effect. So it's kind of game on. Global trade war over steel and aluminum is on unless deals can be struck. And he did give a period of time, right? There is this period now of over a month in which deals can be struck. So the question is, how intentional was that gap? Is there interest in using that threat as a means of securing a deal? And I think we will see. One very important development is his floating of this idea. He said he was going to announce it yesterday or today. So we'll see if he announces it later today. To have a system of what's called reciprocal tariffs, where it would be kind of this tariff equalization, where if, for example, if India charges 30% tariffs on the import of motorbikes, and the U.S. only charges 5%, well, then the U.S. is now going to charge 30% duties on the import of Indian motorbikes, sort of a tit for tat, right? Or eye for an eye, right? And again, this goes back to the reciprocity notion. We're getting taken advantage of. We're going to stop this, right? It would be administratively incredibly complicated to do, because you're doing this, if you do it on a kind of universal basis, you can imagine how this requires essentially rewriting the tariff code, customs. It will be a huge, sort of challenge for them. And it would, probably invite retaliation, and it would be kind of blow things up for a number of trading partners. And then he's also threatened other kind of unspecified tariffs on semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and autos. And, so more to come, right? So then just lastly, what does this mean for the US and the EU? Trump, of course, has said trade with the EU is, quote, an atrocity. Okay. So, not off to a great start there, right? So with steel and aluminum, the EU has been really forced into a trade war that it didn't want. It has taken, over the past months, the EU has, the Commission and member states have talked about, look, can we buy more LNG? What can we do to sort of avoid this thing? The brewing fight with Donald Trump that he seems to want to pick with us. And now he said, look, I'm going to blow up that 232 steel and aluminum deal. And so you're really going to be forced into a position where you have to retaliate. You basically you really don't have a choice. So if a deal cannot be struck by mid-March, I don't see what choice the European Union has. And that is going to make for very painful times indeed. For the reciprocal tariffs we talked about, the pain is going to be felt by the auto industry in Germany in particular, because the EU has a 10% tariff on passenger vehicles. US has a 2.5% tariff. So if they equalize that tariff, that means a 10% duty being charged on imports of vehicles coming in, mostly coming in from Germany. So that's going to cause a lot of pain. If there were to be a resumption of the Canada-Mexico tariffs, that would also be a huge blow to auto companies, European auto companies operating in North America. A lot of activity in Canada and Mexico, cross-border into the US market, both production in the US, reliant on auto parts and partial production in Canada and Mexico, production in Canada and Mexico serving the US market. And then possibility of Section 232 national security trade remedy proceedings with respect to auto imports. So, I hate to say it, but I do feel like the auto industry, and in addition to, by the way, for European manufacturers operating in the United States who may be trying to manufacture vehicles with steel products that are now going to be more expensive due to the steel tariffs. I feel like the auto industry really is in a vulnerable place, particularly vulnerable place with all the tariff threats that we face. And on that positive note, I will hand it back to our moderator.
Thanks, Brooks. Could I just one quick clarification? Is it your understanding that reciprocity would go in both directions? In other words, that the U.S. is
No.
going to lower. Okay. So we're
No.
not. U.S. is not going to lower its duty on trucks, pickup trucks to match the European Unions. It's only a one-way deal.
It's, as far as I know, it's one way. Yes.
Okay, well, that's
I know consistency would be.
Merriam-Webster
would be
might
nice,
need
but-
to
yeah.
add a new definition for
yeah.
reciprocity, perhaps in that case. In any case, okay. Laura, despite what we have just heard, perhaps because of it, do you think there's a possibility, any possibility for cooperation on some economic securities between Germany and the EU and the Trump administration? And as part of that, how far and in what direction do you see Germany and EU economic security policies evolving?
Well, first of all, thank you, Peter and Jeff, for inviting me to join the superb panel here. And in answering your question, Peter, I thought it might be a worthwhile exercise to look back a little bit at the last 4 years to get a sense of the state of things, where we're starting from now with this new administration, the second Trump administration. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Biden years, which came as a relief for Europeans and as an opportunity for rebuilding ties that had been strained. I think that's fair to say. It's also fair to say that I think that in all of the conversations on trade and economic security that we were seeing in the past 4 years, there was always some caution on the European side because of the previous 4 years. And I think that the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, really helped to rebuild ties. And it proved to be a formidable format at a moment in time when the Ukraine war began. So there were really quickly, there was a format to discuss things, all things economic security in relation to Russia. So financial sanctions, export controls, all of those diplomatic sanctions and so on. And that was part of the success story, or a great part of the success story of the Trade and Technology Council, whose future is now at least, let's say, open. I haven't heard any, not in the memorandum either, and not anywhere else in the statements coming out of the White House, any mention of the Trade and Technology Council as a dialogue format, but we'll see. Anyways, so there was this working group on export controls and sanctions that worked well. And perhaps to the regret of the US side, the same things that were happening in terms of coordinating policies towards Russia never happened towards China. So I think there was a hope and an expectation that this could continue to be a body of cooperation, collaboration, coordination on export controls, for instance, but that never really happened. Also on the tariff side, at least on the steel and aluminum tariffs, there was a pause. These tariffs are now being reinstated. And there were negotiations on the Green Steel Club or agreement. But I guess due to doubts on both sides, a lot of second guessing about what the other side really wants to achieve, that we saw a breakdown of those negotiations in December 2023 already. And it wasn't, in the end, it wasn't even possible for the EU to secure a more narrowly defined critical minerals agreement with the US. So another lost opportunity back then for both sides, I would argue. And now, unfortunately, what we see in those past days and weeks coming from the Trump administration is really grist on the mill of the doubters here in Europe, perhaps also in the US, but certainly in Europe. And coming from this sort of state of things, to answer your question on sort of the evolution of economic security concepts in Germany and the EU and opportunities for cooperation with the Trump administration. I would argue that there certainly are opportunities to cooperate on economic security. That could be part of a transatlantic deal or agreement, whatever, a grand bargain that would perhaps not keep us from being under tariffs entirely, but perhaps be part of a deal that might include tariff quotas, lower percentages of tariffs, and then common measures on the economic security side. And I think at least in those past 4 years that we were working with the Biden administration, what you saw on the European side and certainly in Germany was sort of a coming of age process. And you could tell that this is happening not only among trade experts in the European Commission, but also on the side of the EU, European parliamentarians. Also, I think to a certain extent on the national level, politicians were really recalibrating and rethinking the relationship between not only Europe and the US, but most importantly, I think between Europe and China, and to what extent our interests are really overlapping between the US and the EU. So I think there was a learning process on geoeconomic competition and rivalry being the flip side of geopolitical conflict between mostly the US and China. A rethinking of our own approach towards China, and you saw that materialized in economic security strategies that came out. The European Commission published its strategy in December 2023, and there were follow-up papers and white papers and a legislative proposal coming out early in 2024. And in Germany, certainly there was this whole process of the national security strategy and the China strategy, more importantly, I'd say, in the summer of 2023. So yes, I do think there are possibilities for cooperation with the second Trump administration. One obvious area is economic security, or we could also say a common strategy, a coordinated strategy to use economic pressure vis-a-vis China, because that is what the US really is interested in. And I would argue it is something that might also be in our own interest. So we can and we should have a discussion about specific levers the EU can use. I just say it in plain English, to inflict economic costs on China, where in all of those areas where it is in our own interest. From a US and Trump administration perspective, I think Europe's biggest lever is trade, and therefore our willingness to apply tariffs on Chinese exports is likely to take center stage in this discussion, in the discussions to come. And I want to rely on dear colleagues' recent statement. Dan Mullaney, former deputy USTR, right, recently said that in Trump's tariff proclamations, there is little to suggest that other arrangements other than tariffs are off the table. And Trump is making specific allegations of unfair trade practices, circumvention, and failure to address non-market economy policies and practices of Chinese companies and the Chinese government. And this, I think, may indeed provide a potential menu of items for negotiating between the EU and the US. So to your question, yes, I think that would be an avenue, and we can take it from there in any kind of transatlantic dialogue on trade and economic security. And I end there.
So there may be a path forward. Arne, from a more macroeconomic perspective, how do you see the debate, the movement towards some kind of economic Zeitenwende in Germany in terms of its long-held associations about how the economy and trade should function, and whether it's in Germany more broadly, how do you see the possible trade-offs among economic growth, inflation, employment when you think about changing economic models?
Okay, thank you. And thank you for having me here. I'm very glad to be here because if I would be based in the US, I would already be fired because, as you heard, my team has even ESG in its title. So I'm more than happy to be based in Munich for this discussion. Hopefully it will stay this way. But coming back to your questions, you alluded to Zeitenwende. I think there is no need for a Zeitenwende when we, in our thinking about globalization. I still and we still believe that globalization and free trade is basically a win-win situation. And this is what's the best way to increase prosperity and wealth all over the world, across the world. And if you look back, the beginning of the century, the 21st century, the first 2 decades, or the best half of the first 2 decades was testament to these claims. It was a really incredible increase all over the place. And by the way, I mean, there's one country among the advanced countries that benefited the most, and this was the US. If you look and compare the development of the US vis-a-vis Japan, for example, or vis-a-vis Germany, it's totally different, or Europe, totally different story. The US strived during the globalization days. This for sure. I mean, there's a lot of wealth, there's different problems, but this cannot be blamed on your trade partners. This has to be more with your internal domestically issues. Having said that, I mean, the question is rather, what do we do as a lonely free trader in a world where we have rising tariffs and increasing protectionism? And this is a very difficult question. How to behave, and basically, or more precisely, how to strike the right balance between US and China, because these are the two big elephants in the room. First, to US. We have already talked about this. I have a little bit different opinion. Retaliate or negotiate is the question. I'm not a fan of negotiations for 2 reasons. One reason, why should we deliver another quick win to President Trump? Because it will only encourage him to all over again and again to repeat this tariff threat. So nothing is wrong. There's no improvement. And the second point, what can we offer to negotiate? I mean, someone mentioned LNG, buy more LNG, buy more weapons. I think this is wrong direction. We have to do better in Europe. We have to double down in investing in our own energy, renewable energies. We have to double down in investing in our own defense industry, not increase the dependency on the US. This is self-defeating because in the end, if we increase the dependency on the US, we get only more vulnerable or more blackmail. So end of story. So we have, for sure, this is tricky, but we have to start. We have to right now and then have to see as a wake-up call. So that means that I'm in the camp of retaliation. Yeah. For me personally, the best thing, just ignore it. Just let the US consumer pay for the tariffs or the US dollar pay for the tariff. What was the story last time? The US trade deficit increased. German export to the US increased during Trump 1. So just keep it as it's in. anyway, it would be also more strategic in my view. I mean, we know that Trump has no clue about the economics about tariffs. But my fear is that also most of Americans do not really understand what tariff means. So let them learn a lesson, a hard lesson, what it means in terms of living cost, inflation, interest rate. So let it go. For sure, I mean, as you mentioned, the car industry is in a hard spot, but it's anyway in a hard spot. So I mean, even if we retaliate, will not go away. And in this car industry, I think this Canada, Mexico thing is even more dangerous, even for the German car industry, because we have so much production sites crisscrossing the whole continent. So that's okay. So if we have then at that point, then comes to the next thing, what to do with China. And also here, for sure, China has no free trade. That's for sure. It's one of the leading proponents of the might is right camp. But even if we see there's more geopolitical tensions, and even if we see there's more fragmentation does not mean coupling. It has to be very clear. We still have, I mean, I call it always a little bit philosophically the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous, or more prosaic, it's in the small yard, high fence approach. There are certain areas, there are restrictions for sure. Chips, high technology, dual use technology. But there's so much more in the economy, the whole service sector, the whole finance sector, the whole electronics car sector. There's intertwined, deeply intertwined with China. And for sure, we may have seen some extension of supply chain. We will see even some rerouting of supply chains, going to Vietnam, to Malaysia, to Mexico, maybe. But in the end, it's China. Deep Chinization is a myth that will never happen. China, for the foreseeable future, will be at the core of the global manufacturing system. This is a fact we have to accept. And the other fact, this makes it a little bit more positive, is that we can see also that China has a lot of domestic problems. So they're really more and more, more situation, more dependent on our European market. And this is something where we can probably get to an agreement, or to at least to avoid a downward spiral for the trade relations with China and Europe. This is clear. There is some balance. Look, I mean, I'm very frank. I mean, here we did have a disagreement. I think that the US should not define the relations of Europe and China. This would be a big regret mistake. These China-Europe relations should not be on the negotiation table. That's for sure. And last point to you, because you said also economic security, trade-offs. Very simply, I don't see here a trade. This is not contradictory, because this is the same side of the two sides of the same coin. Because we need as many as possible trade agreements with as many as possible countries to secure access to all the materials, to all the inputs we need for the triple transition, for the green transition, for the digital transition, for the military transition, which define economic security. And that means without free trade agreements, we will not have economic security. It's also to think of self-sufficiency or autarky. It's almost delusional. But I mean, for sure, you can build a ship factory in Dresden, nice. But that does not mean that you have now secure supply chains, because all the materials, all the inputs, all the machinery comes from all over the world. Doesn't change a dot. So the only thing to secure economic security, to safeguard economic security, is that you have this kind of mutual dependence, interdependence, or even call it economic deterrence and diversification. That's the way forward. And then we can strive, and then we can be able to achieve economic security and the transition and free trade at the same time. Thank you.
Arne, Penny, if we listen to what Arne just said, I could very, a shorthand would be like China is forever, probably the EU is forever. So that could ask, you could wonder then what are the chances of success of the Trump administration's trade and economic policies if these kinds of interdependencies really are hard to dismantle. So sort of looking at it from Washington and sort of inside Washington, do you see the Trump administration at some point being exposed to some domestic political and economic challenges because of this particular mix of trade and economic policies that it's pursuing? And do you think that the administration is ready for those kinds of challenges if they emerge?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to my fellow panelists for some really interesting starting comments. So I think, Peter, what you're getting at are what are the potential restraints on Trump? And what's going to hold him back, if anything, from doing exactly what he wants in the near future? And so, I mean, what we're seeing is that economics and national security are becoming heavily intertwined. They always have been, but now they're being weaponized and used in new ways, and they're most effective to use against allies. President Trump is not a man who really likes alliances. Alliances are an IOU that somebody can come and cash with him, and he doesn't like that. He is a very transactional person. At the German Marshall Fund, we have a woman who had been his CIA briefer for the first 3 years of his administration. And if you talk with her, what she will tell you is that you really don't need to think that he's playing 4-dimensional chess, because he's not. He's really focused on 1 or 2, maybe 3 things max. And you need to make sure you're continuing to listen for what exactly those signals are. So when Peter, something that I think was done quite well recently was in the Canada-Mexico case, I think Mexico handled that situation pretty well. Sheinbaum was quite tough for her domestic political audiences. But she went to Trump and said, you're talking about the border, I'm going to give you something for the border. I'm going to give you 10,000 troops. Didn't matter, she'd already promised Biden 15,000. So she promised Trump 10. So that's 5 less she has to do. But she also went to him and said, and if you really want to talk about the border, we need to make sure that we stop the guns coming in from the United States into Mexico, which is fueling a lot of the things you want us to stop. So we need to have, and she got something for her own political constituencies. She got a task force on stopping guns coming through the US border into Mexico. On the flip side, you had Canada. Canada, I think, and I have a lot of admiration for Canada and for the Canadian ambassador, but I feel like they paid a little too much attention to everything Trump said. And rather than treat it as a border crisis, when he was kind of throwing off little things here and there, they'd suddenly pay attention. And the question was to come back to, it's about at least this time, it's about the border. Now he's coming after them on steel, and he'll come after them on autos, and they'll have to come up with something else there. But it took them a long time to get to the point to realize it was really, the deal that had to be cut this time was the border. Now, if I could, Trump is a deal maker as well. I think you have to look at the deals he cuts. I'm not sure they're all that impressive. So if you think about Juncker and Trump 1 came over and offered, and they had been negotiating between the United States and Euro a 0-for-0 deal on tariffs. They were going to knock tariffs down 0-for-0. It was all set up. Everything had been negotiated. And then Juncker walked in the room, and instead of negotiating, saying, we've got a deal on 0-for-0, he walked in and said, how about we buy some LNG and some soybeans? And Trump said, done. And so instead of a 0-for-0 deal, Europe agreed to buy some stuff they already needed. So I think that when I think about some of this, it's a question of going back to your point about maybe we don't negotiate, but at the same time, it's kind of I mean, I'm not sure it's the most serious negotiations we've ever had. So who's going to be the restraint? Well, the voters will be the restraint. Another thing that I think you've seen recently, a very specific case that has to do with China, and it has to do with e-commerce shipments that can come into the United States at $800 or less in an informal customs process, and they come in duty-free. And so there's more than, I think, at least 1.2 million packages a day that come in, at least through that channel from China. And so within 2 days of the Trump administration announcing in the executive order that they were going to put in place restrictions on de minimis, the JFK cargo area had something like 2 million packages in it. And the FedEx CEO went in to see the president on Thursday. And on Friday, Trump said, we're going to suspend the de minimis until such time as systems can be put in place to make this work. Now, from Brexit, we've seen it's taken about 5 years to get to the point where they can handle that. So I think there's also an issue between what Trump's saying and what he can actually do. Reciprocal tariffs are going to take years to implement, years. So he can talk about it, but you saw Navarro back off on it yesterday and say they needed to study it more and determine if they're also going to try to add VAT to it, because they think VAT is also a bad thing. So we can talk more about this, but I think the restraint is going to be that. The last thing about tariffs, tariffs are a great thing for politicians. In the United States, politicians who support tariffs overwhelmingly get reelected. And there's been a study done on this. So even though they're bad economically, and there's a lot of case studies, there's a Korean washing machine study that's very specific about how bad tariffs are. They're really great for 1,500 to 2,000 workers who get jobs, but those jobs are incredibly expensive to the rest of the US economy. But they remember, and the labor unions and workers remember that somebody was fighting for them. Last point, I have 3 teenage boys that look at TikTok, and they came to dinner the other night and told me that tariffs are a good thing because it's going to bring jobs back to the US. And I pulled out a couple of PowerPoint presentations and showed them exactly why that wasn't a great idea. As well as a video I made about why tariffs are bad. I have a TikTok video I made on why tariffs are bad. And my kids are very scared it'll show up in their algorithm someday. But just to say that they really are flooding the zone on a lot of this. And even though tariffs they're just terrible, they're so bad. But at the same time, they're really good for politicians, and it looks like you're being tough, and it's easy for people to understand, even though it absolutely doesn't make sense and it's terrible, not only for the economy, but for the future, because you're holding back innovation, you're holding back efficiency, you're holding back all kinds of great things. So with that, thank you all.
Thank you, Penny. Let me pick up on that to start a little discussion. You said that the voters will be a major constraint on, but could be a major constraint on the Trump administration. So I guess that means the Trump administration has 2 years to try out some kinds of policies, or do you think the voters, the restriction, the constraints from the voters could express themselves sooner?
I think it could be sooner. So again, Trump is very sensitive to certain members of Congress that raise concerns with him. So you saw this when he suspended the funding or the transfer of money to state and local jurisdictions in the United States. He stopped that funding. And because of pressure from people, as well as an onslaught of things coming through social media, Trump changed that policy within, I think, a day. So I do think that there are voters and there are things that get to him. TikTok was full of people upset because DHL, FedEx, and UPS sent them a bill that needed to be paid before they could get their Temu and their Shein. And so last Thursday as well, social media was full of people complaining. And by the way, it's red states and people in rural areas of the United States that order the most e-commerce, and they order the most from China. So just like what he's done on TikTok, where Trump has said and changed his mind 180 on TikTok, he's very transactional. So if people complain, and if it's social media, if it's certain members of Congress or governors that start calling him, he will flip. And so I think that's also, it's not just the voter, but he does do a pretty quick course correction if something's going really bad.
So I don't want to overinterpret, but it sounds to me that even though the Trump, especially and others in administration, mentioned certain policy goals of using tariffs, like raising revenue or reindustrialization of the U.S. or leverage for non-economic goals. I mean, it does sound to me like, from what you've all been saying, that an unsaid purpose of Trump's tariff policies is to make deals. He likes making deals, and deals are a way out in case there's, for example, political pressure on any, an individual or collection of policies. So from all of you, do you agree with that? Do you think that if you're looking at it from Washington, or if you're sitting in Berlin or Brussels and you're saying, what should we do about these policies? Should you say to yourself, well, let's take a little longer view, and as long as you do X, Y, and Z, ultimately the goal should be a deal? Or is that too, and Laura, you mentioned that even a kind of a more strategic level, there could be a deal. Is it more just sort of managing on an ad hoc basis individual pieces of the policies that emerge, but never forgetting that ultimately Trump is flexible and transactional, and that opens up the possibility for some kind of deal? And so it's not a question of, say, trying to create another economic pole with the United States, or sort of to being the lone defender of globalization, but it's more a combination of short-term management and then a little bit longer term, finding the big common ground to sort of create a kind of cold peace.
I mean, I think you do always need to be thinking about the transactional dimension of Trump. I mean, I think he's always going to be thinking about the deal and the possibility of a deal whenever he has potential leverage. So, if you're on the receiving end of a tariff measure, yeah, I think you need to be thinking about that. Now, whether you want to take that deal is a different matter entirely, right? So, and what would the terms be of such a deal? I think that's also it's a completely different kettle of fish. But there's no question that that's part of the calculus in many of these tariff measures. And I think, for example, with the Canada-Mexico situation, is it just about fentanyl and immigration? I don't think so, right? I think part of what's going on there is the backdrop is the joint review of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which is coming up in July of 2026. So the jockeying for that begins now, right? So what this does, by having this order in place, these orders against Canada and Mexico in place, he sort of has a sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. And he can keep extending these pauses for whatever period of time he wants. And it gives him leverage over them to get what he wants in those negotiations. And now, in addition, he's got steel and aluminum tariffs hanging over their heads. So it's sort of a double whammy against them, right? Well, autos is yet to come, coming attractions, yes. So, and he definitely has asks for them, particularly in autos, where there is US lost a case on how you calculate regional value content, which is actually a pretty important issue. And they really want to overturn that and have that codified. So there's a number of issues and asks in Canada with dairy, the list goes on. So yeah, so again, that sort of tactical strategic thinking is part of it, right? And I think can be there. And so deal making is something that everyone needs to be thinking about. For Europe, look, I think it's early days. We're all still kind of reeling from the steel and aluminum threat. There's time here. I think the diplomats need to be doing their work and sort of feeling out the Trump administration, testing the waters, being like, look, guys, what is your ask? Is this tactical? Is this, I mean, do you, we know you have certain trade irritants with us. What would those be? Is there an ask here? Is there a grand bargain that you'd like to pursue? I mean, look, all those conversations need to be happening, I think, because, what's the downside to at least exploring it? So yes, I think it's good to have those conversations at a minimum, and then you see, and that's data that you can take into account. And, I certainly take the point that, there's always the risk that you encourage him if you keep capitulating. But I think you have to be pragmatic about these things and at least look at that opportunity and that option to see if it's in your interest.
Yeah, from my side, only two comments. I think one, talk about tariffs, and the European Union, there's probably also the more sees the target or objective behind. Don't forget, trade policy only truly European policy. The only policy that is decided by Brussels is decided by the EU Commission. Members are not allowed bilateral. If Mr. Trump succeeds in dividing Europe, this would be a big win for him because this would really weaken the EU. But can easily imagine threat of the tariff, and then he visits Italy, and then he visits Budapest, and then he goes by some side deals. And this would really catastrophic for the EU. It would be really shaken and undermined. So this is something we have to keep in mind. So this makes it a little bit more difficult to ignore or not to make it. But still, I mean, this, I struggle a little bit with these new things, but if the US imposes those, it's not a good starting shape to negotiate because he has nothing to offer. I mean, Trump says, okay, I have this tariff, and if you give me something, I will undo this tariff. But that's nothing because this tariff will also hurt the US. So this is have to be taken in mind. And that means you should probably, I mean, ignoring is probably not the right way, but to take it literally in the sense that starting point is always this deficits, this trade imbalance. And there are two ways to eliminate this imbalance. One way is that we say we buy more soybeans as we learn, something like that. The other way is that we invest more in Europe. Because this is clear. I mean, the problem that we would call that this underlying of the surplus of Europe, if we save a lot, but we don't invest enough. So that means if you do invest more, if you keep the money here, don't send the money to the US, don't keep the interest rates low in the US, but use all the money for also that automatically was a trade surplus would disappear. So that's the way forward. I think that that's for sure it takes a little bit more time. That means that electing to the other topics on the beginning, you said also there's German election. There's a lot to do with why companies do not invest in Europe, what is the reason for that, and then we have proposed other discussions. And this will be not easily solved, certainly not with the deal. But I think this is the kind of thing I would like to see as European politician going forward, not much about saying it on this tree or on this term. But in the end, it's not the end of the trade, but it's not the end of the
I think, that there's a lot to be, I think, recommended in what you just said about investing in Europe. I think for one reason, I think that not only would it be good for Europe in a vacuum, but I think that the Trump administration, likes strength and probably would have even more respect, let's put it that way, for the European Union if it were seen to be investing in itself. But Laura, I wanted to ask you, how do you see the upcoming German election in that context? Do you think that whatever the likely government constellation is, do you think it's a government that will agree with Arne that the European Union needs to invest more in itself, because it's not going to happen unless the German government, I think, shares that view?
I'm going to get to your question, but I wanted to say something about what's already been said about negotiations. And I think it's important to make a difference between the sort of naive approach towards striking a deal with Trump, which to me also includes this anecdote of Juncker coming to Washington and he's entering the Oval and then there's a deal. Because at least in my world, there's a version of this anecdote where someone sort of took Navarro out of that room. And that's probably part of the explanation. There was a deal in the end. And I think it's important to sort of take the preconditions for making deals with the US on things that are structurally important or strategically important to any US government, whether it's Trump or anyone else coming after him. And therefore, I think China is the main thing to talk about. And anything, and also, of course, the whole discussion about security on the European continent and the division of costs anything related to our own defense, NATO. Many here will be moving on to the Munich Security Conference from here. So you will have these debates over there. And we know with Trump, but not just with Trump, there's an increasing connection between economic policy and security policy. So that, I think, is a structural factor we will have to deal with. And we should be dealing with, because it's in our own interest. And when I talk about preconditions, I get to your question about elections, because to me, one of the essential questions in this electoral campaign that is never raised, or that politicians at least never want to give a definitive answer to, is the debt brake. It's the reason the previous government failed. Yeah, I think essentially it's, you can break it down to the debt brake, because it's in a way, the debt brake is a symbol of priorities not taken. And this government, the past government, couldn't find a common list of priorities. And the next one will have to achieve that. And it will include increasing government spending, which probably, if I look at my paycheck and if I look at the state of public infrastructure in Germany, can't be done by cutting extensively government expenditures. So you're back in the debt discussion about increasing government debt. And we are a strong economy, so we are capable of taking on more debt, unlike other European Union member states. So everyone in Europe is looking towards us. Me personally, as a citizen, I'm looking towards those candidates and wondering if they could finally give an answer to that very important question. And they will have to do that after the election. So after, what is it, 11 days you said away? They will have to sit down in the coalition agreement or negotiations and find a definitive answer to whether they want to take on the efforts of changing the constitutional debt brake. It's still a political decision, and it can be reversed. The debt brake we have can be, we can take a different decision on that and follow a different path if we wanted to. And there will be lots of explaining will have to take place, and it's certainly a tough sell in Germany, in a country you're all aware of that fact that the word Schuld is debt and guilt in one word. So it's a tough discussion we're going to have to have among citizens. But anything less than that is not good enough. I think it's we have on all sides of the political spectrum now, we have candidates saying they want to take on a leadership role in Europe. To me, that's, you can't do that without a certain willingness to also put the money behind your words. And so I can't tell you who's going to be elected and whether it's a stable coalition, but I truly hope it will be, and it will solve that problem.
Since we were just talking about domestic politics, let me ask both Penny and Brooks about U.S. domestic politics. You know, Arne, I think you were the one who was saying that, you know, tariffs are also bad for the United States. We saw under the Biden administration a movement away from the consensus about globalization and free trade, but not an attempt to deconstruct sort of the global economic order. But we saw some questioning of it. Biden said he wasn't going to engage in any new free trade negotiations until there was more investment in sort of the US economy, workforce, infrastructure. We saw other kinds of negotiations pursued that didn't involve market access. And now we have the Trump administration, which is as you explained, taking a strong stance on tariffs. What do you? I mean, I just putting on, if you were sitting in the, if you were a member of Congress in the Democratic Party right now, you know, what should it be doing, or other leaders in it? What should the Democratic Party? What does it do about the fact that Biden thought he was making the right economic choices to get reelected and to address some of the concerns that I think and Harris that they perceived were parts of the sense of grievance in the American voting public, right? And so that didn't work. Trump was reelected. How far out there should the Democratic Party be about either saying, doubling down and saying that, tariffs are bad, or saying something else altogether? Because, I guess Ursula von der Leyen and the next chancellor of Germany could say, make every speech say tariffs are bad, right? But I think it needs to also come from within the United States. So, what kind of narrative can the Democrats put out there that is not a Trumpian narrative about tariffs, but that deals with the fact that people think using tariffs makes you look strong, right?
So if I could, just a comment on that.
Yeah.
So Jason Furman has a piece out in right now in Foreign Affairs, and I think he's 100% right. There's a lot of stuff that policymakers and politicians are trying to do that defy economic theory and defy what actually happens in the real world. And that's where business comes in, right? I mean, whether it be finance or whether it be logistics, I've worked in 2 businesses that are about flows. And the one thing I know is that if water is flowing and there's gravity, it's going to find its way around the rocks in the road. And it sometimes finds its way around the dams even. And I feel like that there's a lot out there at the moment that is magical thinking that in practice just doesn't happen. So going back to some of the stuff that folks have going on, I was reading the Steel 232 order yesterday, and the thing is full of, oh my gosh, we put these things in place, and then it increased for the people that didn't have tariffs. Well, yeah, I mean, that's how the markets work. They're going to go with the stuff that doesn't have the tariff, the cheaper stuff. So there's a lot of magical thinking out there at the moment. There's one other thing, though, that I think people have to really pay attention to, which is that in this American First Trade Policy Executive Order, which looks at a lot of trade policy, there's also a lot of tax. And with the upcoming US tax bill debate and renewal of the tax cuts that's coming, I think there's a lot there where this administration may move off of tariffs to taxes, both indirect and direct taxes, as refilling their toolkit with a few other tools. So for example, in the American First Trade Policy Executive Order, they have pulled out a tax law from 1934 that has never been used that allows you to double the tax on foreign corporations if the country of origin is extraterritorially grabbing US taxes. So you can see that applied because of CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. You could see that applied because of the digital sales tax. You could see it applied for a few other reasons. It's never been used. It was started in response to something the French were doing. So the French always start the tax fights, maybe, but they're now starting to prime that gun, and they're almost becoming communist in that they're developing a series of rules. So they always have that Damocles sword hanging over your head that they can launch. But I think from a competitiveness perspective, Europe also has to watch what's happening with the minimum tax rate and what's going to happen with the OECD Pillar 2 discussions around minimum tax, because that's going to be another really important thing for competitiveness. If the US moves to a 15% corporate tax rate, which they can't afford, but they're talking about, what is that going to do to investment in Europe? So well, we've got our eye on tariffs today. Taxes is another big thing. But the last thing I would say with my European colleagues is I absolutely think this is Europe's moment. People are seeking, and maybe you want to call it the middle countries or the middle powers, but this is absolutely a moment for people to rally together. Trump does not like weakness. He does not like weak people. So Europe has to show up strong and united. And if they can come together with other G7 partners, other middle powers, and stand, you're going to be stronger. So, because it is getting tiring, all these tariffs. Thank you.
Sure. It's interesting. You asked about the Democrats. They're in a really uncomfortable position right now. So, on the one hand, they have in the past been somewhat supportive of tariffs, right? Because tariffs are a means of kind of protecting certain domestic industries, which, goes hand in hand with support for, unions and domestic employment, which are kind of, part of the base for the Democratic Party historically. So, it's an awkward place for them, but they have now been very sort of full-throated in their opposition to Trump's tariff proposals. Very kind of strident. I mean, if you listen to Senator Wyden, really blasting these tariffs. Kamala Harris on the campaign trail was like just ripping into Trump for his, proposal that there be a universal tariff of 10 to 20%. She called this, some sales, regressive kind of a sales tax, et cetera. So, it's an interesting place for them. It's just an awkward place, and it's a place where they have to be very careful in their messaging, because they want to say they have to, and you hear them sort of do this dance where they're like, well, we do believe the tariffs have their place, blah, 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 but these tariffs go really way too far and they're destructive. They're going to hurt working families because they're going to jack up costs and this and this and this. So it is a very awkward place. The messaging can become somewhat garbled. It does put them in an awkward place. So I think they're trying to sort of find their messaging on this and figure out how they can position themselves. But again, I think right now they're sort of pretty firmly, for the most part, in the camp of kind of opposing a lot of his aggressive tariff policies and sort of banking on some of them, if they go forward, really, driving up inflation, driving up costs, and then they'll be able to say to the voters, hey, look, we oppose these things. Look, it's on him, right? And sort of capitalizing on it. So I think that's my read on the situation. And I think it's, ultimately, I get it. And I think it probably makes sense from their perspective. But you do have some people now sort of opposing, his pick, Trump's pick for USTR cabinet position, Jameson Greer. Senator Wyden said, no. He's just going to be a patsy for Trump's tariff agenda. But I think Jameson's going to go be confirmed. So again, you're going to see some going a little further than that. But I think for the most part, that's going to be sort of the general tenor of it, is sort of opposing generally these more aggressive tariff measures. So yeah, I think one interesting thing though is we haven't talked too much about sort of free trade agreements and sort of what their role is. It is interesting in the America First trade policy document we talked about. It does talk about market opening agreements. There is a role in there that it does talk about. It also talks about revisiting existing trade agreements to sort of see where they've gone astray, where they can need to be fixed, right? But it does talk about that. And Jameson Greer, in his confirmation hearing, did say that he wants to open new markets to U.S. goods, and he wants to pursue certain types of agreements. Whether these would be full-throated FTAs like those of old, the big comprehensive FTAs, we'll see. It's unclear whether there's appetite for those big mega FTAs anymore. Certainly, the Biden administration didn't think so. The experience of the Obama administration trying to get TPP passed, right, was kind of this brutal experience that I think a lot of people came away from and thinking, we're never going to try that again, right? The FTA is a thing of the past, right? We'll see if the Trump administration actually takes that position. But so look, I think there is an opening for certain trade agreements. But meanwhile, we have the EU just blazing on ahead, right? And leaving the US in the dust, right? With, agreeing, the agreement with Mercosur, kind of totally retooling its agreement with Mexico, being very strategic and thoughtful through these agreements, getting access to critical minerals, lithium, with the Mercosur agreement. Canada sort of talking about leveraging CETA, and really, channeling lots of critical minerals EU's way. So being really, again, doing very savvy strategic things that I think, are going to really benefit it in the long run. So the question is whether Jameson, his team, will sort of be able to persuade the president to sort of think about these things and explore them amid all the tariff noise. And if in some ways, will the friction caused by the tariffs and maybe the leverage that he could get because of the tariffs, will that lay the foundations for certain types of agreements? And he can, so the tariff man, which he calls himself, kind of give way to Trump, the deal maker, So TBA, we'll see. But it's something to watch.
Oh, then
Yeah, just as a follow-up question to what Brooks just said, I said that I'm a strong believer that there could be deals between the EU and the US, but it's in particular when you talk about Jameson Greer and perhaps his sort of former boss, Robert Lighthizer, and if you look at the book he wrote, it's all about the denial of access, of market access as a starting position, and not really about new free trade agreements, right? And so my question to you is really, with the debate that is coming from the US Congress, in fact, not even the Trump administration, but on PNTR in China and taking away most favored nation status of China, which was, I think, essentially lead to a complete breakdown of the WTO. I can't really see any path that would allow a continuation of this world global trade order in a situation where the US took away those rights from China. So where is the silver lining towards the trade agreements and free trade in this? Or is this just a thing that will somehow die along the path and it's not serious?
Well, no, it's a great question. And I think it remains to be seen what this line in the America First Trade Policy memo actually means, and what Jameson actually means when he says, market opening agreements, right? And by the way, Bob Lighthizer, Jameson are Skadden alums, so don't always agree with them on everything, but we know them well. So, but again, and I'm not sure that both would be sort of philosophically opposed to trade agreements, full stop, right? I mean, certainly Lighthizer, negotiated the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. He, there was the U.S.-UK FTA, right? There were negotiations for, a free trade agreement with Kenya, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I think that there's Greenland. There you go. Greenland, that's right. But I think it remains to be seen. Would these be, for example, kind of mini deals, sectoral deals, very transactional, limited agreements that deal with sort of, narrow topics? It's quite possible, right? And that's been sort of the trend since the failure of the TPP to get approved, has been more narrow, kind of low-hanging fruit deals that are kind of more one-offs. That's quite possibly the path, right? But we'll see. We'll see what kind of backing he gets from the president to do these things. I would say that for Congress, there's a lot of pressure to get USTR, the administration back on the path to do some market opening. So a lot of frustration in the Biden administration not doing that. And I think, with the Republicans in Congress, they really want to see that. So we'll see. But it's something to watch.
I'm just going to say, I think the big constituent there is ag, as well as digital trade. Those are the big two. But just quickly, for the heart and soul of the Democratic Party, I think that there's still there's still two paths that they're trying to figure out which way the Democratic Party is going to go. The more populist, looking more progressive populist path, continuing to lean into the liberal side of the Democratic Party and going further, or as embodied by Rahm Emanuel, kind of going back to a more centrist Democratic Party. And I think the jury's still out on that. Ezra Klein, I think, is trying to be the leading Democratic voice on this from the New York Times, if you ever listen to those podcasts. And Ezra does great podcasts that are extremely interesting, but again, they're told from a kind of a New York elitist kind of view, as opposed to what's really going on in the heart of America. And what's going on in the heart of America is they're too darn busy to really pay attention to any of this stuff. They're just trying to get through every day. And so that's where I think the Democratic Party still has to make up their mind on what they're going to do and how they're going to go after it.
We just have a couple minutes. I'm going to use it to end with, I hope, end with a German voice, looking at you, Arnie. And I wanted to, in order to do that, just want to quickly, gently push back on what you said about the EU and globalization. I mean, it's certainly true that up till now, the EU has had a stronger welfare state than the United States, and that may have cushioned the EU a bit from some of the impacts better than it did the United States. But one big difference is China. And while the United States was mostly suffered from the first China shock, I think there's a lot of talk about a second China shock where Germany, for example, already is suffering. And the EU recognizes that, even though Germany voted against, I think, not abstained, the tariffs on Chinese EVs. This hits at a lot of the core of the German economy. So if you're looking forward, couldn't we imagine that there will be increasing skepticism towards globalization and the resultant change in policies because of a second China shock?
Yeah, I mean, it's not only the second China shock, it's also the energy price shock, and it's also the general feeling that the German growth model has come to an end, because we were very proud to be a stronger manufacturing, excellent engineering, export-led. So engineering now, yeah, good in engineering hardware, but not software, not in AI, not in this kind of stuff. I mean, even if you look now at the car, it's not so much the Freude am Fahren, it's nice to drive it, but it's also entertainment around. And this is the Chinese that's leading the field there, maybe Tesla also, but definitely not the Germans one. So we get ever more the impression that our strengths are more strength of the past, and the future economy is more driven by software, services, and all this kind of businesses where we have not a natural strength in it. So, I mean, there are two. Then you can try. I think this is the wrong way. Then you can try to keep the structures and try to fight it and to keep the jobs in this old industries, fine, for a while with tariffs, or you move on. And I think the better way is, because we have also some strength. I mean, even with AI now, we have this Paris summit. I think Europe is not so far behind. It's not so bad. We have quantum technology. We have this green technology. And I still believe, I mean, even what Trump says anyway, there will be, because it's a technological change. And in 20 years, we will have the energy system based on renewables. So there is no question how fast we move forward, but because it's a superior technology, it's much cheaper if you make it right. So that's some strength. So that I think the tricky, and this will be the challenge for the new government, and the thing to convince people that, yeah, we stay open, we have this trade policy, but we have to define new fields. We cannot always stick to the car industry. It's a strength that we're all proud of, all our supercars, but it's something we have to leave behind. I mean, we did it before, and we have to move on, but this is easier said than done. This is a structural change, but I think that it's capable. And again, what you said, I truly believe this is now Europe's moment. And this has to do less with probably Europe's strengths, but it can become strengths, but it has more to do with the US decline. I mean, still, I mean, in fact, the US is still the most powerful economy, it's militarily the most powerful, but it's losing rapidly trust in soft power. And you ignore trust in soft power for your own terror. I mean, in the end, in my view at least, the real strength of America was always his values, his freedoms, call it the American way of life. This was because all the people went to America. I mean, look at Silicon Valley. I mean, this is, I mean, if you talk about migration, I think every CEO is mostly born in India. No, I don't know, maybe it's an exaggeration, but a lot of them. So, and this is now, I think we have to withstand that this kind of transactional thinking, tariff thinking becomes mainstream. We have to oppose it. We have to say, still, there are values. This is a good thing. And there are rules that have to be observed. There is a rule base. And then I think we can become more attractive, the European way of life, for all the rest, because it's not only America. Maybe the American hate us, be it. But the Indians, the Brazilians, all the others love us, the Africans. And this is a big, I think, asset we have as Europe, where we can probably build on, and that would be the way forward. But it's also in a hard sell. I mean, we are here maybe in a bubble, I don't know. But face it, I mean, Trump is not only in America. We have many Trumps, would like have been Trumps also in Europe. And it's not that we have no polarization into all these things. So as I stressed before, the key is this unity. That Europe's keep together can keep this unity. And this cannot be taken for granted, because we have a difficult situation. In Germany, we have this election, maybe until summer, no real government. France, they have no government, no real government to speak of. And then we have this Meloni, probably now the most powerful politician in Europe. So much about European unity. It's a hard, really, probably an uphill battle, but if we manage it, then we will shine.
If you're listening, Europe, there's your pep talk. And please join me in thanking all the panels.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our second panel today. I also welcome our followers online. Just reminding you that you may also ask questions online if you want to later during this panel. If our technology here works, I should see that at some point and try to get you involved, as well as take questions from the audience at a later stage. Welcome back. Briefly introducing myself, Andreas Nick. I've been affiliated with the Institute for almost 20 years, going back to my Zeiss Johns Hopkins time. Great to be back in Frankfurt, where I spent 15 years of my career as an investment banker before being member of parliament from 2013 to 2021, and a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, dealing with a number of the issues that we've been doing. I'm now partner at Brunswick Group, and I'm delighted to partner back with my good old friends at now called AGI. I still have AICGS on my mind when I'm here, and very pleased to be here. Let me briefly introduce our great panel. I'm very happy to meet again Ambassador Emily Haber. Welcome. She was ambassador to Germany to the United States from 2018 to 2023, so covering a huge part of the first Trump administration, following an impressive period as a career diplomat, rising to political director and state secretary at the German Foreign Office, then taking also a stint as state secretary in the Department of Interior, looking at migration and security issues as well. And we are very delighted to have you here to join our conversation. I welcome Leonhard Schütte, senior researcher at the Munich Security Conference with a great academic track record on both sides of the pond. You've just published the MSc report called Multipolarization. I was wondering when I saw the title whether that was almost euphemistic or whether it's more depolarization that we are experiencing, but we'll should be able to explore on that. And the panel is obviously complemented by our own Jeff Radke, president of AGI, who in this circle needs no introduction, with an impressive track record as both in diplomatic service and think tanks almost around the world. Ambassador Haber, you've been experiencing the first Trump administration right on. If we look what may expect us from the second part, one memorable quote of one of my American friends, who may even be in the room at the time, was, well, you Europeans take Trump literally but not seriously, but you should take him seriously but not literally. If you reflect on your dealing with the first Trump administration and looking back, what do we have to anticipate in terms of style, demands, and the theatrical elements of politics? And is there something Germany could have approached differently in the first Trump, or ways in which our experience now will be or may be different from the first Trump administration?
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I think the general wisdom is that we'll see a lot of patterns of the first Trump administration in the second one, and we do already. The disruptive mode, the bilateralization, the fragmentation strategies vis-a-vis partners. We see the, you called it the theatrical element, that is the performative feature, and sometimes the experimental feature. Because very often it is not strategic objectives that define the procedure, but the wiggle room and the tactics that define what is achievable at the end of the day. But as we are now in the second Trump administration, it's also worthwhile looking at what has changed and what will inform the Trump administration. And I want to pick out one element, because we have talked a bit about the inflation bit. We should do that again later on. But I want to pick one element, and actually it also refers to the Munich Security Risk study. Some of you will have seen the polls conducted by the ECFR in January. The poll established what the Munich Security Report also identified, and that is that it is only in a number of European countries and in South Korea that the Trump administration, that the Trump election is viewed with trepidation. This is not the case in most parts of the rest of the world, from China to India, from South Africa to Brazil and Turkey. Now, the question is in place why this is the case, and there will be different reasons for it. Chief among them will be that these countries do embrace transactionalism. And that, of course, reflects on the view, on the view these countries take on Western geopolitical power, what people call liberal world order, the rules-based system, and the values you had mentioned before that have been shaped mostly by Western geopolitical power in the global international order, in the global governance systems. And if America abandons these principles, or in part abandons these principles, rules, procedures, institutions, that surely will have a huge effect on many countries of the global South that were never quite that never quite accommodated a system and its rules and procedures that were shaped by the West. So here we are. And if we have to acknowledge that this will indicate a development I wouldn't have predicted a year ago when I was here. 2 years ago, the ECR had also published a poll in which it identified a growth of Western geopolitical unity. The contrary is now the case. And in this zero-sum world, the rise of transactionalism and the growing erosion of the international order will have effects on Europe and on the transatlantic relationship. And we'll have to deal with it. And as we deal with it, we'll have to bear in mind a number of factors. The first one is we are dependent on, insecurity-wise, we are dependent on America. This will not change overnight. It will not change in the foreseeable future. And even if America casts doubt on the reliability of the security guarantee, it does not alter our interest. The same is true, by the way, with regard to the international order, because it's a fact that the international order had been mostly shaped by Western power. And if America turns away from wanting to shape it, or from actually moving to dismantling it, it does not alter our interest in the system itself and in preserving it as much as we possibly can. My second point, which we need to bear in mind, is for every single European country, the relationship with the United States is the single most important bilateral relationship Europeans have. And certainly outside of the European Union, but I bet you that many European countries will actually claim it's the most important relationship, which opens up a lot of space for fragmentation and bilateralization strategies of the American administration, and not only in trade issues, but across the board, because it will affect us across the board. Now, of course, as you said, our crucial interest is retaining and keeping European cohesion, because that alone will allow us agency and security. But here's my key point, and I acknowledge that I probably am not contradicting, but I'm saying something which is in contradiction with much of what has been said before. If we believe we can achieve European cohesion or unity by shaping a response as leading the liberal world order opposition against the United States, forget it, because that will fracture the European Union, given the polls I've just mentioned, in ways we couldn't expect in 2016 or 2017. So if we make our opposition or resistance to Trump's America a key feature of European policies, the effect will that we will be struggling and will actually be fueling fragmentation interests of the American administration. Which means that if we seek cohesion, we'll have to take up the American argument. There's a reason why Trump has been elected for a second time. The reason being that the globalization consensus that existed for about 2 to 3 decades in the United States is not accepted by large swaths of the American population anymore. They believe that open and free trade and open borders and liberal market economies, etc., will produce benefits for the population, or that investment in alliances will actually benefit the American global role and global status. People don't believe that anymore. 70% of the population wanted change. And there's a reason why US aid is targeted in the first instance, because no one takes any interest in it. And Democrats haven't really reacted to it because I think they're saving their resistance efforts for issues that will really mobilize the American population. So here we are. If we don't frame our reaction as a response to a massive geopolitical tectonic change in geopolitics, in the geopolitical landscape, in geoeconomics, in technology, we will not be able to retain and expand the cohesion and the unity we need. So that's the way forward. Investing in our resilience, investing in our security, in our capacity to deter, in new partnerships, I agree with that, in new partnerships, absolutely. But let's not frame that as a response to America. Let's frame it as a response to the changed reality of geopolitics nowadays.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very instructive introduction to our discussion, looking at it from a zoomed out perspective. And I think it is also a main change of what we have seen from the first reaction to the first to the second Trump presidency. I think in 2016, both domestically and internationally, I think too many people were, I think, okay, this is a thunderstorm that will go through and then we'll be back to normal afterwards. And a lot of my former colleagues in parliament, I have to say, were under this illusion after the Biden election, ignoring that I think there are more fundamental shifts in the US society that we will have to acknowledge. And I think let's use the chance to explore that a little bit more. And Leonhard Schütte, the conventional wisdom, I think, suggests Donald Trump and his team are much better prepared this time around to implement specific policy objectives than they were last time. I would somewhat cynically say the jury seems to be out whether this is good news or bad news, but also in question, especially in foreign security policy, whether he will be much more unhinged from being surrounded by a team of more traditionally minded senior officials, as we've seen it for large parts of the first administration. When he came to office 2016, I think many in Berlin were under total question mark what the thinking behind this new, because for the first time, we had a total disruption from the traditional foreign policy establishment that we had seen both sides, Democratic and Republican. I know you've studied quite a lot about this thinking of the Republican Party in foreign affairs. Can you give us a bit more background, I think, on, let's say, the more fundamental shift of how the American foreign policy debate, especially on the Republican side, looks toward NATO and Europe as we go, and what this means for the perspectives on US leadership and the balance between the sacrifices, compromises that leadership may require and the expectations for European allies to do more.
Yeah, thank you, Andreas, and let me take the opportunity to thank both Brunswick and the AGI for putting this timely event together and inviting me. And I should also say I spent a couple of wonderful months at the AGI last year, and I'm going to draw a lot from that research stint in my remarks. So if I say anything that doesn't make sense, blame Jeff. On a second, what Ambassador Harbour said, I think it is clear on foreign policy that that post-Cold War consensus, that bipartisan post-Cold War consensus that held that the US has a special interest in and responsibility for the globalized world, the international order, is definitely over. Now, the key question is there something coherent coming up as an alternative? And I don't want to paper over very serious divides within the administration. I think on China policy, on Middle East policy, I think there are still those divides between the MAGA crowd and the more traditional Republican hawks, even if, you know, that balance clearly between the two camps have shifted towards the former compared to the first. And my fear, though, is that there is an agreement on Europe policy. To me, you know, across the administration, there seems to be three assumptions that are shared. First, Europe is no longer a top strategic priority. Second, Europe is definitely rich enough to defend themselves. And third, in an era of actual scarcity of resources, those resources are much better spent in the Indo-Pacific than in Europe. Now, I think that has very concrete ramifications for NATO policy and Ukraine policy. So if you allow me, let me just sketch out what I think the Trump administration is going to do here. Now, in Ukraine, it's difficult to say. It's, you know, fairly speculative because we haven't heard that much yet from the Trump administration. We know that Keith Kellogg, his envoy, is in Munich this weekend, and we expect to hear a little more. I think the emerging strategy is to force both the Ukrainians and the Russians to the negotiation table by, on the one hand, threatening Ukraine to cut military assistance and threatening Russia with increasing military assistance and increasing sanctions on Russia. Now, whether that's going to work is not for me to judge. Perhaps the even more critical question on Ukraine is what is going to happen after a potential ceasefire, however far that might be away in the future. And here, National Security Advisor Waltz recently said, we will ensure there will be a peace. Europe will ensure the peace will be held. Now, I think we should not underestimate the consequentiality of what this would mean. Because if you subscribe to the premise that Putin will continue to have an interest in imperial expansion towards Ukraine and beyond, Ukraine will need very serious security guarantees to ensure that Russia's deterred from future attacks. And I think there are three broad options. All of them are pretty bad or unrealistic. First is NATO membership. That's not going to happen under this US administration. Second, European troops on the ground, assuming that the US will not put troops on the ground in Ukraine. Now, I don't need to tell you in this country how politically sensitive that would be. Furthermore, there are very serious question marks about whether the European armies actually have the capacity to put up a sufficient force to deter a Russian attack. And the third model, the most likely, but probably least persuasive one, is the sort of the porcupine model there, the sort of the eagle approach in German, to empower Ukraine to just defend against Russia in the future by, paying military assistance to Ukraine, empowering the defense industry, keeping the economy afloat, and so on. Now, I think there are very serious question marks in Kiev and elsewhere whether that's going to be enough. So this is, the statement by the US that the US will not play an active role in ensuring a ceasefire carries vast repercussions for us. Briefly on NATO, we know, and probably Ambassador Haber more than anyone in this room, that Donald Trump holds the alliance in disdain. He seems to, for decades actually, have had a problem with NATO. There are, anecdotes that in the 80s and 90s, he put out New York Times advertisements where he criticizes European allies for not pulling their weight. So this is, I think this goes beyond transactionalism. There's something, quite deeply held there. Now, I don't think something like a formal NATO withdrawal is in the cards and is something we should necessarily worry about. What I think we should worry about are very concrete plans, both being developed within the administration and in Trump-affiliated think tanks, to reduce the US military footprint in Europe. Because as we've discussed already, given the extent to which Europeans are dependent on the US in security terms, the US withdrew key capabilities from Europe, would essentially leave a security vacuum in Europe for a few years, at least, which would essentially invite Russians to exploit that vacuum. So, fairly gloomy. I guess it falls to the security crowd to be the cause of gloominess here. But I think in this country we haven't quite grasped the gravity of the situation in security politics. If you follow the debates between the candidates for chancellery or beyond in the election, there's a distinct lack of urgency and seriousness when it comes to defense spending and other things. Because I think, and that's my final point, the clock is ticking. From within the Trump administration, we hear that at the NATO summit in June, they expect very, very serious plans from the Europeans, including significant upping of funding on how the burden of the transatlantic relationship will be recalibrated. Now, this is in 4 months. I don't see that urgency yet, but it's badly needed. And I hope in Munich on the weekend, we'll take the first steps towards it.
As you already touched in quite some detail on the key question of Ukraine, I would like to ask a follow-up question on that. One aspect that surprised me when this debate came up, also with some of our American friends saying, yeah, we will have European or EU troops on the ground in Ukraine to secure the peace, that no one seems to have the idea to use an institutional umbrella like the OSCE for that, which from my former foreign policy perspective would be the logical platform. I don't know what Ambassador Haber thinks about that, but to frame that as EU troops or NATO troops on the ground to secure that, the OSCE would broaden that, including Turkey, also a NATO member, but also some of the Central Asian countries or others who could participate in that, which would make that look much less like a Western occupation, the way it could be portrayed in the Russian media. And it may be symptomatic that no one seems to think again anymore of these multilateral organizations that we formed exactly for that purpose as peace and security in Europe. But that was, I think, triggered by your comment on troops on the ground. It's something that I would like to get back at some point. But you have a response immediately before I go back to Jeff on that, or Haber?
Well, I was head of the OSCE division in the German Foreign Ministry 20 years back. And I tell you, just thinking about OSCE member countries' troops, it will be subject to Russian veto power. You know that the OSCE is a consensus organization, so you'll actually charge the cook with negotiating with the chicken. So, I think that's not an option.
Where it is, but clearly the US and Canada would be at the table as well in that format, which have another point. And without Russian buy-in and support, it would probably be very difficult to make that arrangement work.
But none of the non-military OSCE missions in the post-Soviet space have been stories of success. There have been stories of procrastination and obstruction.
Very good point. Very, very instructive on that regard, but I think it would still make it quite difficult for Europeans to agree on any concept where they would be on the hook to secure this on the ground. We had this debate when it was about how can we secure the Russian-Ukrainian border before the invasion as part of the Steinmeier formula and everything, but let's not that well into history. Let's go back to the United States. Jeff, as was alluded in this conversation, I think when we were looking at Trump 1 and serious debated, yes, the geographic shift to the Pacific, the demand on Europeans to spend more on defense, but is there something more conceptual even now behind what we see unfold in the Trump 2 administration? I think we have seen this quite interesting new demands on Greenland, Canada, Panama Canal, that go way beyond the policies of the first term. Talk of changing borders, which I think has an immediate impact, I think, on a lot of other subjects we have been discussing. And also from the inauguration speech, these analogies to President McKinley and the late 19th century, for me leads to the question, is there a new philosophy in the making that is underpinning a lot of what we're seeing, rather than just disruptive activities, but something which is much more conceptual and much more rooted in an American tradition, at least of the pre-Wilsonian era, and that fires back on the question of the multilateral international liberal order.
Thanks, Andreas. I think it's hard to find a single unifying theory because, as we've already heard, and I agree, there is quite clearly among people whose job it is to develop foreign policy for the Trump administration, they have a number of fundamental assumptions about the way the world works, the way they want the world to work, and those are about things like, lack of trust in international institutions, a deep skepticism or antipathy about alliance responsibilities, which they see as I think we already heard, as sort of a one-way ticket. They are an obligation the United States takes on itself without immediate compensation. And the way the Trump administration views alliances, I think, is that they are constantly under review. And you see this, actually, the Japanese prime minister visited the White House, and there was a long statement, which is worth reading, which reaffirms in some ways a number of the things that have been through lines in American policy toward the Indo-Pacific. There is a commitment of the United States to the relationship, to the treaty with Japan, for example. And it goes through a number of other areas. And so you might see that as reassuring, but I think it's also a reminder that, again, from the point of view of the Trump administration, alliances are always subject to renegotiation as circumstances change. And they feel quite free to state that circumstances have changed, quite spontaneously. And I think there's also a changed focus. You see it in the Panama Canal issue, I believe, as well as the Greenland issue in a way, a sort of regionalism focus We were talking earlier today, there's a piece by Hal Brands from a few months ago in Foreign Affairs, in which he talks about it as continentalism. I'm not sure that's entirely right, but the core element, which is a focus on security and affairs closer to America's borders, is one element of it. So these are all parts of what we see already in the second Trump term. But there is also something else that I think is about messaging to the American public. This idea that through territorial expansion, the United States becomes greater, not just in a geographical sense, but in a broader sense, is something that clearly is animating Trump, and it serves a purpose because it gives an additional justification for the otherwise, economically driven arguments about tariffs, about trade, and so forth. And it also puts the president in the position of, let's say, aspiring to a new idea of national greatness. And while these things which involve breaking taboos of, let's say, the changing of state borders, whether through force or coercion or other means, they don't sit well in the foreign affairs worlds that many of the people here or watching online operate in. But I think they serve to explain to an American public that normally is not going to re-elect a president based on his foreign policy record, or even vote him out of office based on a failed foreign policy record. George W. Bush was re-elected. That this is a way of connecting and trying to tell a different story about America. And I think the stagecraft, the dramaturgy of presidential office is something that is very important to Donald Trump, and that we see in the way he tries to structure events. So I think this is another aspect that we should be prepared for in the next 4 years.
In foreign affairs currently, which is headlined "The Rogue Superpower," which suggests that American supremacy into the 21st century will be largely backed up by technological superiority and by demographic superiority. And that will be the background also for a lot of Trump policies that we will be seeing beyond the Trump presidency. I think one of the most obvious signs next to territorial demands in the neighborhood is the absolute disdain for soft power that has become pretty clear in the demolition of USAID, withdrawal from the WHO, from the attacks against the ICC. Especially if I look at USAID and WHO issues, these will have the potential, I think, to lead to significant destabilization, also in our specific neighborhood, not least Africa. We've been dealing with refugee issues before in the Ministry of Interior, and it, I think, also plays, and that maybe I think you had the idea to come back also to some of the topics of the first panel, where I think this horizontal linkage between foreign security policy and traditional trade and economic cooperation policy, from my perspective, are a bit underestimated in our perspective so far. And I would invite all of you to comment on that in the next round.
Okay, well, the borders between national security and the economic and trade issues have been blurred over many years. Also during the Biden administration, I still remember how Gina Raimondo said she was the Secretary of National Security. I mean, commerce, right? So that's not entirely new. What's new now is the degree in which the administration is ready to mercantilize security issues. And that's important for Europeans because no one in the first Trump administration could reckon with the very existential threat of a Russian aggression in European geography, right? So it makes the tool and the security issues so much more a much more powerful weapon than it was in the first years. Can I just, to illustrate the change, mention something that Jeff said? Yes, you called it continentalism. Now, I would make the argument that one of the oldest traditions of American foreign policy was always consolidating and securing their home base. Goes back to the late 18th century. And it was a tradition that the first presidents over the last years, the first presidents the American president would call were always Canada and Mexico. And it was reflective of the sense that having a cooperative environment on your home base, on the continent, was part of American power projection. Now, the difference is palpable because it's not a power projection by consolidating via cooperative diplomacy. Now it's power projection by coercion, exactly, by demonstrating dominance and telling a story of dominance. That's a massive, massive change. So I'd call that at the beginning of a new tradition in hemispheric thinking in the United States. And that would actually include Greenland. Someone like Sulzberger in the 70s had called Greenland part of the American hemisphere. It's not new. What's new is the modus operandi in handling these traditions of thought.
Perhaps just on your point on continentalism, it's actually more of a question to both of you now that I have a chance. Sorry, moderator. Now, what I'm seeing here is the beginning of tensions between continentalism on the one hand and the sort of the overriding focus on the bipolar contest with China, right? We saw it because, you know, when you spell out the end of USAID, it's tragic for many of the individuals involved, but it also creates vacuums across the world. And we know from Chinese foreign policy that they're only too eager to fill those. So, you know, beyond the humanitarian aspect, I think there's a strong case to be made that it is strategically extremely unwise. And we've seen this in many other ways. You know, if you look at the many of the tariffs, you know, the first countries to be hit by tariffs were the continental neighbors, and then it's probably going to be the European allies that are going to hit with harder tariffs than perhaps China. So, you know, I've been quite struck on how soft the US policy on China has been in the first few weeks, and the rhetoric, and how tough it's been in its vicinity. Is that an emerging tension, I wonder? Is that something I'm being ignorant about, or is there more perhaps to it than the two of you see?
I think we see this as, in some ways, echoing the experience of the first administration, where there were certainly some tough policies toward China. But I think if you look at the rhetoric and the energy expended, it was at least as much about, you know, trying to alter the relationship with America's closest partners and allies than about, you know, going after America's adversaries. And I think that's a continuation. There may be a variety of reasons for that. One is a certain risk aversion when it comes to an actual adversary. Although there might be trade retaliation from the European Union, I don't think anybody is particularly worried in Washington and staying awake at night, wondering about what the Europeans might do. So that's part of it. It's just easier to send a message by, you know, demonstrative moves toward your allies than than toward a power that might be unpredictable and have greater weapons at its disposal in retaliating, like China. And I think there's also just a caution about it. And that's where I think you see the pressure on Panama, regardless of what you think about the Panama Canal Treaty and whether there's been any meaningful way in which Panama has not fulfilled the terms of the treaty. It's placed in a China frame. So it's a way of, appearing to do something that is about China's growing power and its potential to interfere in our hemisphere, but without making it a direct, immediate challenge to China in the Indo-Pacific. I'm not sure it will stop there, but that's, I think, a way to make a step in that direction without exposing too much of a flank.
Can I react too? Now, it surprised me too that the president's rhetoric on China was so reticent over the first weeks. Now, can I just pick up one case, and that is the Colombia case? Because when I saw how the tactic unfolded, I felt reminded of a playbook by the American economist Hofbauer. He has once studied the issue, when do sanctions work? And he concluded he inferred four conclusions. The first one was it works if you put maximalist demands on the table. Second, it works much better with democracies than with authoritarian states. Third, it works much better when the requested change of behavior is fairly minimal. And fourth, it works better if you apply them on allies than on adversaries. Do you see? It was exactly what happened there. I mean, President Biden had already accepted the military flights. The change of behavior was minimal. The threat and the announced sanctions were incredibly huge. So my conclusion is as yours. I think the president is prioritizing pressure and coercive successes with allies and partners and democracies because they work better. And this will in turn help to tell a story of dominance, because if you start the other way around, can turn out to be a Ponzi scheme. But if you start that way and it works step after step, then it tells a completely different story of dominance.
One additional factor there is asymmetry. Colombia versus the United States, there's no comparison.
But there is asymmetry in every single, in relation to every single democracy across the world. I take the European Union, but the European Union needs to be united. And one of the fissures of European disunion is actually the relationship with the United States, or could turn out to be, and that's a danger.
As we touched upon China, that has been the elephant in the room for a long time, and it will remain that, I think, for the next few decades. We have learned a lot about strategy of denial, both in military terms and if we go forward even more in technological terms, when you look at artificial intelligence and others, as one of the key US objectives against containing China. Which also brings to the front, I think, the issue of technology. I was a bit surprised that in the first panel, we didn't even touch on the question of regulation of tech companies in Europe, which may be even more contentious early on than tariffs from my perspective. But looking at the view on China, I think we saw a lot of convergence under the Biden administration, I think, between the US and the European position on China. As we go forward, we'll be interested to see how the Trump administration evolves on that. My perception is, and I think Charles Grant, a European think tanker, coined this phrase, it explains the difference very well. Europeans may resent what China does. The US will always resent what China is, namely a potential rival for political and economic supremacy in the world. in that framework, where do you see areas of, let's say, convergence or divergence on China policies between the US and the EU?
I find that extremely difficult to predict because for the moment, we're just faced with a huge uncertainty. Yes, there's some very, very hawkish China people in the Trump environment, but so far he has given no indication where he's going to move. And the possibility ranges from deal making to a massive escalation that would prevent a deal, but accelerate the economic and technological disintegration. No one is able to predict which way exactly he's going to proceed, and that makes it so difficult for us to define areas of convergence. My response to that is, let's first figure out what we want, what Europeans need, where our security interests are affected. Let's not define our interests as a response to the American president. Let's define our interest as a response to a changed geopolitical reality, which has implications for our economy, our businesses, and first and foremost, for our security.
I agree with that 100%. I think there is certainly far too often the discussion in Germany is about expectations from Washington rather than about European or German interests and what policies and instruments are necessary to pursue them. And I think China is a good example of that. I mean, certainly if you go back to, it's been many years in the making, going back at least as far as 2019, when BDI had their comprehensive China report. You see a change in the understanding across Europe about the risks and vulnerabilities in the relationship with China. And I think that should be the basis on which either a future German government or the European Commission or the EU member states talk about this with Washington. It's not about what would you like us to do, Trump administration. It's about, we have decided that in pursuing our interest, we are going to do or consider the following things. And then let's see if those things align, and can they perhaps be harmonized, coordinated in a way to enhance their effect, rather than waiting with, I think you used the word trepidation earlier, Andreas, waiting with trepidation to see what Washington is going to ask for. I think that's a hopeless game to play.
Yeah, if I may, my fear is that that consensus that you just described, which began in 2019, is very precarious, though. I think there is a distinct danger that if the US pushes the EU far, perhaps too far on tariffs, it will strengthen those voices in Europe that have been saying, well, we should, we shouldn't be too confrontational with China anyhow. And, perhaps the most hawkish voice on China in the EU so far has been Ursula von der Leyen. When you go back and listen to her speech at Davos a couple of weeks ago, it was fairly conciliatory towards China. I think we're seeing first just subtle signals, both to Beijing and Washington, that the EU's policy towards China is not predetermined. It could, again, regress, in my view, towards a softer stance on China. And that is precisely because we have not sufficiently defined our interests vis-a-vis China, irrespective of the United States. But again, I think that is very precarious. And I think that is something where we could actually see a regression if push comes to shove.
Thank you very much. Before I think we open the floor for questions from the audience, I would like to look a bit more at the immediate issues. We have a NATO summit coming up later this year. The Congress will look at budgetary issues for defense spending. And on the European side, we will have at some point to answer, not only talking about 2%, 3.5%, 5%, but what this means in practical terms and how it will be financed. We have a EU Defense Commissioner who is largely charged with supporting the further build-up of a European defense industry. something that will not necessarily be unilaterally popular in Washington as well. I can well remember when we had first discussion about something called PESCO. The then US ambassador to NATO said in the round of NATO ambassadors, no, we don't want a European defense industry. We want you to buy American. So there is also a trade element involved there. But clearly also the question, is there a European leadership foreseeable that will be able, both domestically on a pan-European level, to push through the budgetary implications and the practical implications of investing significantly more in their own national security? Maybe we start with the US budget and get to the European, and to give Emily Haber a few more minutes to reflect on the response.
Thank you. So let me start with the point you made about defense purchases. I think the United States now, across both parties, and including Republicans, has probably the least ideological view of the European Union's role in defense that has existed in 30 years. I mean, I remember as a State Department official, we fought tooth and nail trying to fracture European unity or prevent it from emerging on things like this. Because there was this worry that it would decouple European security from American security. And there are a few diehard stalwarts who still remember this, and maybe in some positions, some senior positions, but basically time has passed them by. And I think it's another important difference now, Andreas, to the time when PESCO was a new thing, is that the United States during the Ukraine war has sensed its own defense industrial capacity constraints. And so for, and it was indeed, Vice President Vance, that was one of his principal criticisms of this military support for Ukraine, was the limits of American industry to produce things like 155 millimeter ammunition. So I think a European leader, whether it's the defense commissioner or the commission president or a German chancellor, I think can quite persuasively argue now in ways that it wasn't so possible before, to say, look, we know you don't have in the United States the capacity even to meet your own needs, and we're not going to place additional burdens on that capacity. We are going to do some of these things ourselves. There will always be a sort of mercantile interest, and that will never go away. But I think there's a different mood. People don't want to have fights about NATO and EU theology, because the sad fact is, as Leonard said, there is this ambivalence about NATO. So people aren't going to fight as hard about these institutional theoretical questions. With regard to the US defense budget, of course, Trump has said he wants European allies to spend 5% of their GDP on defense. The United States won't reach that, but it'll probably be at about 3.5% again next year. Depends a little bit on how this very uncertain budget situation develops. There are competing ideas about how the Republicans will manage their majorities, and whether they will have one bill, two bills. All the details are being hammered out. Will the Senate approach win out over the House approach? The main thing is, I think you're likely to see an increase in U.S. defense spending once a budget passes. It will probably take us up to $900 billion, if not $1 trillion dollars on an annualized basis. And you're going to see some investments in some major marquee initiatives. One will probably be to strengthen the Navy, where there's a real concern about U.S. naval capacity with regard to China. And also, people may have noticed that President Trump made an announcement and signed an executive order about creating an American Iron Dome. Now, the idea of, from a technological point of view, the idea of creating an Iron Dome over the United States of America would cost, amounts of money that would be unfathomable. But the point is, having an ambitious perceived to be game-changing initiative that would put American security on a different footing than it is now. And there, I think you also see an echo of the Strategic Defense Initiative of President Reagan, which drove liberals mad, and also drove a lot of American allies mad because they worried about its effects on stability. But the other side of that coin was it was an expression of ambition and intent that, even if it never quite materialized, motivated a whole generation of defense innovation. And I think that is the thing to keep one's eye on.
Yeah, let me just underscore what Jeff just said. I mean, there are people in the US, in Pentagon and elsewhere, that actively say to the US industries, do not sell stuff to the Europeans. This is a completely 180-degree change from how it used to be, and also how it's still perceived. Because one of the things we hear a lot in Germany is, well, you just buy more American equipment, and that's the way to placate Trump. I think there are many reasons why this is not going to work. One is that the US defense industry doesn't have that much surplus capacity to absorb enough to make significant changes with Trump. I think that's something we really need to understand. Perhaps on the NATO summit, I think there's a real window of opportunity. Opportunity sounds very, very euphemistic, but there's a window here where we have a new German government in place, hopefully around Easter, just after Easter. There is the release of the EU White Book on Defense that will, in EU lingo, basically say there are ways for European defense bonds, and here's how to do it. And there is the NATO summit, which, as I said before, the Trump administration expect a massive defense spending pledge from the Europeans. We're talking 3.35. In fact, just briefly on that number, because again, that's something that is discussed in German debate a lot. I myself, I'm not a fan of an arbitrary number like that. There's so much more to effective defense than just spending an X amount. The Greeks have been spending more than 2% for a long time, and that's not necessarily buying equipment, but other things. It's well, that's what you said. But here's the big but. There are very serious NATO calculations based on planning scenarios of what it would take to defend against, say, a Russian assault. And based on those war games, capability targets are derived. And from then onwards, you can make fairly serious calculations what it would cost to purchase them. And according to the latest media reports, on average, allies need to spend 3.6% for an extended amount of time. Now, for those of you who had the pleasure of watching the election debate last Sunday, both the lead candidates of the Social Democrats and the Conservatives agree that 2% is really necessary, but disagreed on how to fund it. I think this is completely past the reality that we'll be talking about in The Hague at the NATO summit and people talk about in the US. 2%, that was your grandmother's, your grandfather's, your great-grandfather's target. It's not today's target. And so I hope that this government, the next German government, will sense the urgency, because they will only have a couple of months to at least prepare some sort of pledge that will sufficiently placate the Americans. Because otherwise, I think all bets are off what's going to happen at that summit in The Hague in June.
Well, there's not really very much to add. I agree with Jeff that the times have passed where the Americans viewed European defense ambitions as an onslaught against NATO and American interests. That's the case. Though I would also add that a key prism of American policies vis-à-vis the European Union has been during the first Trump administration and is again dealing with individual European countries and not preventing a development that would reinforce European collectives' identity, including security identity. It's less mercantilist worry, but it's a strategic worry which is defined by economic interests. By which I mean the European America looks at Europe through a fragmentist prism, because in any bilateral situation, America will have an asymmetric advantage, which it will be reluctant to give up. So I think you'll have to accept that aspect as well. There is, as far as we are concerned, I think we shouldn't look, Europeans, I mean, we shouldn't look at a strategic autonomy and transatlantic cooperation and even purchases as a binary choice. I think both will have to exist in an uneasy coexistence. My last point is, it's obvious, to me, it has been obvious over the past years that we haven't sufficiently grasped the urgency of shaping a long-term European cohesion. Germany would have had to play a central role, and the European vote of Germany in Brussels is legendary, abstention. That will have to change given the changed environment I've described, and the biggest country in Europe, the largest economy, will have to play a central role. And that includes conducting very difficult discussions on priorities, resources, focus, and posteriorities.
Absolutely. And I think there may be also opportunities if we need to build up capacity in defense industry. It could be an answer to some of the automotive component industry workers who maybe become obsolete as we go through technological change. We've just seen the transformation of a railway plant in Görlitz on the Polish border to a military vehicle facility. I'm pretty sure we'll see more of that, and maybe that is even opportunity for US defense contractors to invest into Europe. But maybe we can discuss this in March when we meet back in DC. I've at least two people from the audience who would like to, Klaus-Dieter Frankenberger, Johannes Bockbrand. Klaus-Dieter Frankenberger needs no introduction.
Vielen Dank. Mein Name ist Frankenberger. I'm a non-resident senior fellow with AGI and our commentator with FAZ. Thank you for doing this very interesting, enlightening discussion this afternoon. You said before, people here, the public and the policymakers and the body politics basically underestimate the seriousness and the gravity of the situation. I fully agree with your observation. You watched the campaign, and one is disappointed by the lack of addressing these deep issues, the geopolitical and geoeconomic changes. And they affect tremendously our country, probably more than most other countries in the world. Is our German model, our business model, are at risk? Has it's run its course? A lot of people think so. Domestically, this country undergoes tremendous changes. There's a great volatility amongst the public, restlessness, as one of the titles of news alluded to. So we are actually at a moment of Zeitwende, domestically, economically, and in the international arena. And that's my question is, if I may, Jeff, it would go to Nick. Because, I mean, I know you are out of politics for a while, at least in national politics, but it's likely that the chairman of the group you still belong to will be the next chancellor. Do you think, are you confident, I'll lay it in your mouth, are you confident that he himself and the team, the people he has assembled among himself will understand the seriousness and the gravity of the changes in the international arena that affects our interest and, yes, our values? Or will he have all his hands full of forming a coalition, maybe with the SPD, with the Pistorius SPD and the Klingbeil SPD, that will give him something on the immigration front, and that's about it? Absorbed by domestic priorities and not being able to do all the things, and I fully agree with Botschafter Haber, that are necessary on the European level, in contact with the United States, and on the wider arena. Thank you.
Into a difficult position. I'm no longer, as you said, no longer a politician. no longer a politician. Let me put it this way. I think it is no secret that I was more skeptical about the runs of Mr. Merz for party leadership in 2018 and 2021 because I didn't feel it was the right answer to the challenge that we had at the time. Maybe I'm willing to acknowledge that at least he has the opportunity, and maybe if he grasps the mantle of history, that he could be even the right person at that point in time, which I think nobody could necessarily predict in 2018 or 2020 in terms of the economic challenges and the security challenges. I think he is a convinced transatlanticist. He's a very convinced European. He's a economically very skilled person for the standard of German politics. And he is, if he uses, I can say that as a former investment banker, and if he grasps that opportunity, also being in the position of being almost 70 when he ascends to the chancellery, to take on that responsibility and not play just short-term politics, but really go for the big strategic issues. That's the positive. I think that's the opportunity that's out there. Whether the political environment domestically will allow him to do that, and whether it will absorb a lot of this energy for other subjects is a question that you have rightly asked. I hope he can overcome what is sometimes described as a challenge. With all the positive I said, he's never been in government a single day in his past career. So being in the difficult business of forging coalitions, forging compromises, building parliamentary majorities in what may be a 6 or 7 party parliament, if worst come to worst, that could be indeed a very challenging environment, but not only for Friedrich Merz, but for anyone who would be in this position at that point in time. So from my perspective, let's hope for an action result that will at least enable the formation of a stable and not too broad coalition. But it will very much depend, I think, on the outcome of the individual parties, and it will depend on the strength of leadership, both on the CDU side and potentially on the Social Democratic side. I don't necessarily see the Social Democratic leader that could take the role of Franz Müntefering in 2005 or Sigmar Gabriel in 2013, but I would not exclude that either Boris Pistorius or Lars Klingbeil can step into those shoes if required. But it is a steep challenge. That's much more on politics than I tend to say publicly these days. Johannes Pogrand.
Hi, I'm Johannes Pogrand. I work in Citi's government affairs team. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It's an honor to have you. I think the previous question was so excellent and so relevant because I think we often underestimate or don't appreciate how significant the mandate for change is in the US, right? Right after Election Day, what we did as government affairs with many of our clients resembled a lot what John King and Wolf Blitzer do with the magic wall, right? Just zooming into county level, zooming into ethnic minority results, making people appreciate how big this mandate for change is, right? So I guess the luxury the president of the United States has is that a lot of what he can do, or a lot of what he does is pretty popular. Whereas a lot of what we in Europe need to do is pretty damn unpopular. And I'm based in Citi's Paris office, and there's actually someone in town who for quite a while now has been trying to do things with mixed success that are pretty unpopular, but some of them would be quite important for France, right? So I guess my question is, when do you think someone in Berlin will actually reach out and shake that hand that's been waiting for 7 years now? And nobody in Germany is really shaking that hand and really taken up all these proposals coming out of Paris, or at least reacted to them in a meaningful way. Be very interested in your thoughts, and thanks again for being at Citi today.
You were afraid to.
Yeah, so I was speaking of the president of the French Republic, and the notion that, look, I think in my lifetime, he's the first and last president that celebrated an election win with Freude schöner Götterfunken rather than the Marseillaise. I don't think we'll ever see that again. So that opportunity has as I think we have 2 years left, right, to do something with that or not. Thank you.
Johannes lives in Paris now. That explains, I think, why he's so interested in that. But fair point. But we may be at a difficult time for that, also in terms of French politics. But I defer that to the panel.
If we are to craft European cohesion, it won't work without France. Won't work without France and Germany both taking responsibility in the lead. I agree with that. It will also require center stage a country like Poland, by the way. So I think the engine is a three-pronged engine, if I can use that wrong metaphor. We need these three countries to set the tact for change in Europe.
Were you going to wrap up?
If you want to.
No, I don't need to
Get
add.
to
I
the
was
question.
just going to do
No,
the
no.
sort of.
Last chance for your, let's say, for your closing comments, Leonard, and for Jeff then to wrap up the whole.
Well,
event.
yeah, no, I was going to skip straight to the wrapping up.
Okay, perfect.
Then,
If Leonard agrees
but
to that.
I didn't want to jump ahead. I want to thank Johannes. It was great to have your intervention here at the end. I want to thank Citi once again for hosting us. And through their generosity, we also have a reception afterwards. So please stick around, continue the conversation with our panelists, with people you've been talking to already, and we look forward to that. So thank you for coming out today, and the American German Institute is really so pleased to have put on this program today with you all here, and wish you all the best. So thank you.